right, so we are up to Mark chapter 7. We are reading through the Gospel of Mark, one chapter at a time, as you know. And by the way, I don't know if I've told you already, if you decide to read it in one sitting, it'll take you about an hour and a quarter. So if you can imagine the early church sitting around about 20 or 30 years after the time of Jesus, getting this letter, because all they've had up to this point is anecdotes and stories and word of mouth, and someone said and someone heard. And maybe a few little letters that were floating around. But finally they had something that was a little more all-encompassing in its scope, and it was called the Gospel of Mark. And we suspect, well, at least Bible scholars suspect, it was the earliest or the first of the Gospels. And so they're trying to piece together the story of Jesus in terms of knowing what it means to be a follower of this Jesus. There were times of deep persecution, times of deep confusion, idols, multiple gods. I mean, the Roman gods, the idolatrous practices of the nations around them, and then this Yahweh sect of the Jews, again pressuring the early Christian community and then wondering, where do the followers of Jesus fit into this? Where do we fit into this big story? And so they needed to know a lot about him. So Mark chapter 7, we find the story of Jesus again being unpacked, nuanced and layered by Mark. There are primarily three stories in chapter 7. The first one, which is what we're going to focus on today, verses 1 through 23, talks about that which defiles coming from the outside in, and Jesus having a contrary narrative to that. We'll look back at that in just a moment. Verses 24 through 30, we've got the Syrophoenician woman, this incredible woman, the only person in the Gospels actually that I can recall who actually won an argument with Jesus. And we'll see why that's important again in just a moment. And then verses 31 through 37, where Jesus heals a deaf and a mute man by putting his fingers in his ears and touching his tongue. And again, this sign being a commentary on what he's talked about in the first part of Mark. So let me just read the first part of Mark together, because that's the story I'd like to focus on today. The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. You notice that Mark puts in these little editorial comments, because a Jew reading this would go like, they know what that is. But Mark is also writing with a partially Gentile audience in mind, non-Jews. And so, again, he has to explain that. So, hence the next comment, which is in parentheses, he says, the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Comments like that are how you know that Mark is writing after the fact, that he's not following Jesus around like a digital reporter, just videoing and writing down everything. This is a reflection for those he knows that he's writing to, in this case, the early church. Verse 5. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their foods with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written," and again Isaiah wrote 600 years before this, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued. So Jesus then, he's made his point, and then he drills in with a specific example. And this is the example he gives. "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God to order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said," who again was the Jews like, ooh, Moses. The law came from Moses. The laws of community came from Moses. The 10 Commandments came from Moses. So to the Pharisees, he was everything because they knew he spoke for God. Jesus challenges their narrative and says, "For Moses says, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say, if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban," and again parentheses, that is something devoted strictly to God, "then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them. And after he'd left the crowd, and this is the narrative again that Mark says, the disciples don't get it. They're following him and they're listening to this stuff and they're like, what? And so Jesus typically will take them to aside, they'll go to a house, and after the crowd's dismissed, then they'll ask him. So his disciples asked him about this parable after the crowd had left, verse 18. And Jesus says, "Are you so dull?" My translation says, "You are so dumb. You don't get this." He asked, "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach." So you notice where Jesus says defilement isn't something that comes from the outside and affects us physically. It's actually something that comes from inside and affects what we do externally. For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body. And again, another parenthetical comment. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. So the early church would be going like, ooh, so we can eat anything, because there were Jews and Gentiles living together, and the Gentiles would be saying, you can't eat fish, you can't eat this, you can't eat that, you have to do this. And here we have Mark clarifying some of the practices for the early church. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it's from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness." And we understand the horridness of those things, but listen to where the list goes from this point. It's all part of the same list. You notice Jesus does not differentiate. He says envy, slander, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. You know, we have these classifications, don't we, of sin? And for sure, different sins have different consequences in different realms of our life. But it's interesting to see that Jesus packages those things that are both moral and character-based in the same sentence. So where I want to spend just a couple of short minutes here is this first passage in terms of understanding what it is that defiles us. Jesus says it's not that which comes from the outside. And actually, this is a sign, I believe, of an immature or very young faith, believing that what defiles us is out there. So those people, that thing, that stuff, that movie, that conversation, that person, they defile us. And if we hang out with them, or if we are in that environment, we are at risk of becoming unholy or impure, or in this language, defiled. And so what early religion does is it seeks to separate itself from those things and says, oh, if I want to be God's person, God's man and God's woman, I need to separate myself from those things. And to some degree, I think in early days faith, that's very necessary. I think of myself, I was an addict to hardcore rock back in the 80s. And like some of the hardcore rock that I listened to back from the 80s, now I'm going like, it's nothing compared to some of the death metal and thrash metal and the different genres of metal that are out there right now. But that was my thing. I was quite addicted to it. I really loved it. I'd play it loudly and aggressively while I was driving. And I remember when I became a Christian, early days faith, it became very apparent to me that God was saying, you've got to separate yourself from that. That stuff is no good for you. It actually is a part of the culture in which you've come from, and you need to separate from that. So I get the early days separation from that which defiles, or even those relationships that can damage and affect us. But that's what I call early days faith or immature faith. And Jesus is coming along here as a Jew and seeking to take the narrative forward in terms of what it means to move to a more mature faith. So the Israelites needed to be distinct from the nations around them. They needed to have separate practices. They needed to do things that removed them and separated them and gave them distinction from the nations and the gods around them. But Jesus says here now that actually next stage faith, next stage maturity, we need to recognize what's happening there. What we're actually doing is projecting our own brokenness, our own anger, our own defilement, and projecting it out there. And Jesus says latter faith or more mature faith or later stages faith is something that actually will first of all own the defilement, problems, brokenness, anger, shame. We have to deal with them here first, because it's not the stuff out there that defiles us, it's the stuff that's in here that actually defiles us. And this is a massive shift in the narrative. Mature faith first owns that which defiles ourselves and lives with this in the tension of understanding a good God who would seek to move us forward now back into the place of defilement, and understand that purity now affects that which is defiled. It's an interesting thing. You're going to see this a lot in the Gospels. The Pharisees were always trying to separate themselves from defilement, sickness, a woman with an issue of blood, leprosy, stuff like that. You're going to notice that Jesus, because he is next stage, he is moving the story forward, puts himself into those situations, and his purity, his power, his wholeness actually steps into the defilement and changes it. In other words, the narrative is Jesus comes and moves towards it. This is latter stage faith. See, this is what we understand now as the term by scapegoating. So in Leviticus 16, what the Israelites were commanded to do was to gather as a nation once a year, and they'd get this creature called a scapegoat, poor creature. And what they would do is through the priest would lay his hands on the head of the goat, confess the sins of the nation, and thereby in this sense, displace or move the sins of the nation from Israel onto the goat, and then they'd boot the goat out into the wilderness, of course, where the goat probably got eaten by something or starved to death or died of thirst or something like that. And so the sins of the people were removed because they were able to objectively take their defilement, their shame, their sin, place it onto the animal, send the animal away. Well, Hebrews 10 says, actually, that doesn't work. Because we actually know that actually can't deal with the sin that we have to deal with. And so that's what, when we put the defilement out there, that's what we're actually doing. We're scapegoating. It's called the scapegoating mechanism. And it might work for us for a season, but it actually doesn't transform us. Jesus exposes the lie of scapegoating and says the only way you can actually be transformed is to first of all own who you are and what you've done yourself. See, when Jesus came, he didn't come to reinforce the purity codes. What he did was he came as the kingdom of God, as purity itself, and helped us understand that purity would now affect us. And so the people who were gathered around Christ were the impure ones, the unacceptable ones, and the purity and the beauty of the kingdom would now affect them, so that then they could carry on and take the mission of God out into the world. So Jesus didn't come to change God's mind about us. In other words, to be that scapegoat so that God could now look on us with favor. And what Jesus did was created a space for us to put our sin where we could own it. And what he did was, in effect, enabled us to change our mind about God. And that's the beauty of Good Friday. Good Friday is not so much about God changing his mind about us, because now he has a scapegoat. The fact is, we now have a scapegoat, and now we can change our mind about God because of what God did on our behalf. People who haven't come to at least a minimal understanding of some of their own dark side will always find someone else to hate or blame or fear or someplace to put it. We've got lots of examples of this through history. The Nazis did with this with the Jews. The Nazis did this with African Americans. They did it with homosexuals. In the Armenian genocide, the Turks did it with the Armenians. In Rwanda, the Hutus and Tutsis did it to each other. In Southern American history, the slave owners did it with the slaves. As long as we can place the blame or place the shame or place our violence into some other realm, then we actually don't have to deal with it ourselves. The other thing about scapegoating is if we can create a common enemy, then actually it's a very powerful tool to bind us together even in our brokenness. The problem with this is once we don't have a common enemy anymore, we start to tear ourselves apart. And the reason we do that is because we haven't dealt with the violence and the shame inside our own life. So look, the beauty of the Syrophoenician woman is that she's a Gentile. And Jesus then goes into this place, and this Gentile woman bests him in a conversation. And she would be considered impure. And yet she bests Jesus. And then moving on to the miracle of the hearing and the dumb man, Jesus is making a commentary on both the Pharisees and his disciples who are around all this stuff, but they are not getting it. They can't speak it because they haven't yet heard it. And so a part of the beauty of Easter coming in is that we might examine our own hearts, understand that we are loved and accepted as we are, that the beautiful thing about Easter is that we are accepted in our brokenness as we present it to God, and we find ourselves reconciled with him. So look, God bless. Mark 7 is a powerful chapter, and I pray that you find the peace of God as you allow him to deal with your darkness, as he has done and is doing with mine. God bless.